All right, let's dive into this concept of steadfastness. It's a pretty loaded word, isn't it? We've got all this source material here, a bunch of different thoughts and ideas and reflections, and they're all kind of spinning off this one word, steadfast. And it got me thinking, like, what does it actually mean to be steadfast in, the real world? Like, we all like to think of ourselves as loyal and committed and all that. But how do we actually live that out?
Well, and it's interesting. Right off the bat, your source material throws this really interesting curveball. It starts out, a pretty standard definition of loyalty. Being loyal is to believe in someone or something even when things get hard. But then it sort of flips the script and says, hey, you know what might be the hardest loyalty of all? Loyalty to ourselves.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, you don't usually think of it that way at first, but when you say it like that, it really makes you stop and think. I mean, think about it. We're always making promises to ourselves. We set goals, we say we're going to change habits, we make all these grand plans. But how often do we actually follow through?
And that's where I think some of these insights into human behavior in your source material are just spot on. There's this part where it talks about like wanting the slow moving ball to hit us, even though we know it's going to bring back some feeling that is ultimately harmful.
Such a great analogy, right? It's that self-sabotaging thing we all do sometimes.
Oh, totally. Like knowing you should go to the gym, but then somehow you end up like on the couch with a bag of chips. You know it's not good for you, but there's this weird pull toward the familiar, even when it's not doing you any favors. Why is that so hard to break? Those patterns.
Well, your source material seems to suggest that it's, partly just our brains. Like we're wired for comfort and routine, and it takes effort to break those ingrained habits. But it's also this self-judgment thing. Like we're so much harder on ourselves than we would ever be on anyone else.
Oh, absolutely. We beat ourselves up for the tiniest slip-ups, which just makes it like 10 times harder to get back on track. Right. So what does your source offer as a sort of antidote to that?
Well, they really emphasize this idea of self-awareness, but without the judgment. So like noticing those relapse moments, but without piling on a bunch of self-criticism. It's more about viewing those stumbles, not as failures, but as stepping stones. Like each one is getting you closer to being more steadfast in your commitment to yourself.
So it's kind of like shifting your perspective. Instead of obsessing over the missteps, you're looking at the bigger picture, the fact that you're even trying to make a change.
Exactly. And each time you pick yourself up and try again, you're strengthening that foundation of self-loyalty, making it a little easier to stay true to yourself the next time around.
That's really encouraging. It takes the pressure off being perfect. Like it reminds you that growth is a process, not this overnight transformation. But steadfastness, it's not just about personal growth, right? I mean, your source material also gets into this whole idea about staying true to your beliefs. And that can be a whole other challenge, especially when those beliefs are like unpopular. Oh, absolutely. Taking a stand when everyone else is disagreeing, that takes serious courage. And it's easy to either just dig in your heels and get stubborn or to just cave and conform to avoid conflict.
So how do you navigate that? How do you stick to your guns without, becoming rigid or just shutting down other points of view entirely?
Well, your source actually offers some really interesting guidance here. It basically says that real steadfastness in your beliefs, it doesn't come from blind faith. It comes from this reasoned conviction. It's about understanding why you believe what you believe and being able to explain it clearly.
So it's not enough to just have the belief. You got to be able to explain it and defend it, I guess.
Exactly. But here's the thing. It's also about being open to hearing the other side. Your source actually argues that engaging with different perspectives, even the ones you disagree with, it can actually strengthen your own position. Or it might reveal flaws in your thinking. And it's a sign of like intellectual humility, a willingness to actually grow.
I see what you mean. It's like if your beliefs can't stand up to a little scrutiny, maybe they need to be re-examined, right?
Yeah.
It's a pretty radical idea, but it totally fits with this whole idea of steadfastness. It's not about clinging blindly. It's about like constantly refining your understanding of the world.
Yeah, you nailed it. It's about having the courage to question, to challenge your own assumptions, and to be open to changing your mind when you're presented with like real evidence or a good argument.
Okay, so we've got this pretty high bar for steadfastness now. It's not passive at all. It's this active engagement with the world, which actually, I think that leads perfectly into the next thing your source explores,
Yeah.
this whole idea of loyalty and trust in relationships.
Because in relationships, just like with our beliefs, that unwavering dedication is constantly being tested.
Exactly. And your source acknowledges that relationships take work, right? Like Loyalty and trust, those aren't just givens. You've got to earn them and re-earn them, especially after, disagreements or betrayals.
Yeah.
And it all kind of circles back to that self-loyalty we were talking about before.
Because, as your source quotes Anna Kendrick, we are stuck with ourselves for the rest of our lives. If we can't even forgive ourselves for messing up, how can we possibly expect anyone else to?
Wow. That's that's really powerful. Self-forgiveness is like the foundation for any relationship. If you can make amends with yourself, you're in a much better place to make amends with other people. But I'm curious, how does that stepping stone idea, the one we were talking about before, how does that apply to relationships?
Well, what your source seems to be suggesting is that, like, every time you work through a conflict, every time you rebuild trust with someone, you're basically laying a new stone. You're creating a stronger foundation for the future.
So it's not about avoiding conflict altogether. It's about figuring out how to work through it in a way that actually brings you closer.
Exactly. Which leads us to this other question that your source raises, which is, when is it okay to walk away from a relationship, even one that you've, put a lot of time and energy and loyalty into? Because sometimes holding on too tightly can be just as damaging as letting go too soon, right?
Right. Like knowing when to hold on and when to let go, that's a huge part of being steadfast in a relationship. It can't just be blind loyalty, can it?
Nope. And get this, your source uses this surprisingly optimistic word for it. They call it truncating. Like, sometimes ending a relationship, while it's never ideal, it can actually be the healthiest thing for everyone involved.
I like that. It's like pruning a plant,
Mm.
right? Sometimes you have to cut back some branches to let new growth happen. But then that brings up another question. How do you know when a relationship has reached that point? Like when it needs to be truncated?
Ooh, yeah. That is where things get really tricky. And I think that's a perfect spot for us to pause and let our listeners ponder that very question. We'll come back to this idea of balancing loyalty with knowing when to let go, for everyone's sake. We'll dive into that a little deeper after the break. So before the break, we were talking about like this really tough question, right? When does steadfastness in a relationship actually mean letting go? It's such a tricky thing to figure out. And your source material really doesn't shy away from that, like from how complicated it can be.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, one of the analogies the source uses is like a bad marriage. Sometimes divorce, even though it's painful, it's actually like the best thing for both people. It's not about giving up on marriage altogether. It's just admitting that sometimes two people just aren't a good fit.
Exactly. And your source makes this point that, like, just because a relationship ends, it doesn't mean that either person is, a bad person. It could just be that they're not compatible. Or maybe, like, they've both grown and changed over time and the relationship just can't, it can't keep up.
It's like that saying, sometimes good things fall apart so better things can fall together, right? Like letting go, but doing it gracefully and respectfully, that can open up possibilities for both people to find something, something better, something that really works for them. But this whole conversation about truncating relationships, it makes me think about all the different kinds of relationships where steadfastness matters. I mean, it's not just about romance, right?
Oh, definitely not. Your source material actually touches on this too, like how this idea of unwavering commitment, it applies to friendships and family relationships and even like your professional life. And each of those, each area has its own unique challenges when it comes to like staying true to your values and to the people you care about.
Yeah, totally. Like think about friendships. We all have those friends who've been there through thick and thin, but sometimes friendships, like, they shift. People change. And what used to feel like, this unbreakable bond, it starts to feel strained. So how do you navigate that and still stay true to that whole idea of steadfastness?
Well, that's where, I think that self-awareness that your source keeps talking about, that becomes so important, like asking yourself the tough questions. Is this friendship still good for me? Am I being my real self in this relationship? And maybe the biggest one, am I holding on out of habit or is it a genuine connection?
Because sometimes, loyalty, it can kind of turn into like an obligation
Mhm.
instead of actual affection. And that's not healthy for anyone. It's like you're holding each other back.
Mhm. Exactly. And your source seems to be saying that, like, sometimes the most steadfast thing you can do in a friendship is to create some space, to allow each person to grow. Maybe that means taking a break, or maybe it means like shifting the dynamic of the friendship, or even just admitting that, it's run its course.
Wow. That's a powerful thought. It's like real steadfastness isn't about clinging to the past. It's about being like present and being adaptable when things change. And I bet that applies to family relationships too, right? I mean, those can be the most complicated relationships of all.
Oh, absolutely. Family dynamics, they're so layered. There's all this history, all these expectations, and sometimes like tons of unresolved conflict. And your source kind of acknowledges that to navigate those relationships with steadfastness, it takes this like delicate balance of loyalty, forgiveness, and healthy boundaries.
Yeah, because on one hand, there's that unconditional love thing,
Mm.
right? And that sense of obligation that comes with being family. But you also, like, you have to take care of yourself. You have to set boundaries sometimes.
Right. And your source doesn't try to like give you all the answers there. It just encourages you to approach those relationships with honesty and compassion and a willingness to communicate even when it's hard and to recognize that sometimes the most steadfast thing you can do is to step back. Like you create those healthy boundaries, you protect yourself.
It's so important because steadfastness shouldn't mean sacrificing your own, your mental and emotional health. It's about finding that balance between, honoring your commitments to others and also staying true to yourself.
And speaking of staying true to yourself, your source material, it also explores how this idea of steadfastness shows up in our professional lives.
Mm.
It's interesting, right? Like those same principles of loyalty and integrity and commitment, they all apply in the workplace too.
Yeah, because, I mean, especially nowadays, people change jobs all the time. Careers are less linear. Like the whole concept of professional loyalty can feel like a little outdated.
It's true. But your source actually suggests that even in this world where everything is changing so fast, there's still value in cultivating professional steadfastness. Like finding work that actually aligns with your values and then committing to it, doing the work with integrity and building those relationships with colleagues, relationships based on trust and respect.
So it's not about staying in the same job forever. It's about bringing that same spirit of steadfastness to whatever you're doing, whether it's a short-term project or a long-term career. You show up, you do your best, you contribute.
Exactly. And your source says this kind of professional steadfastness, it can be so rewarding. Like it can give you this sense of purpose, of mastery, of like deep satisfaction with your work. But it also brings up some really interesting questions about loyalty in the workplace.
Yeah, let's be honest, work can be like a minefield. There's all these power dynamics and office politics and sometimes ethical dilemmas that really like test your moral compass.
Yeah.
So how do you stay true to your values when you're faced with all of that?
That's where, that whole thing about reason belief that your source was talking about, that becomes so important. Like taking the time to really examine your own ethical compass, knowing where you draw the line, and having the courage to speak up, when you see something that's wrong, even when it's scary or risky.
Right. So it's not just about following orders or going along with the crowd. It's about thinking for yourself, using your judgment,
Mhm.
and doing what you believe is right, even when it's hard.
Yes. And your source says that kind of moral courage, that's a key part of like true professional steadfastness. It's about being a force for good, in your workplace, standing up for what you believe in, even when it's not popular.
That takes guts, especially at work where there's so much on the line. But it all comes back to this idea of steadfastness as an active choice, right? It's not about just accepting things as they are. It's about taking a stand and like helping to create the kind of world you want to live in, both professionally and personally.
I think you've summed it up beautifully. Steadfastness, it's not about blind loyalty. It's about making choices, choices that line up with your values,
Yeah.
and then living those choices out.
It's about having the courage to stand up for what you believe in, even when it's tough.
Mm.
And it's about being willing to let go when something's not working anymore, whether it's a belief, a relationship, a job, whatever.
Perfectly said. And with that, I think we've really come full circle in our exploration of steadfastness. We've touched on so many different aspects of it.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. I feel like we've just scratched the surface of what this word really means. But as we wrap things up, I'm curious to hear your final thoughts. Like, what are some key takeaways that you hope our listeners will walk away with?
Well, I think if there's one big takeaway from all of this, it's that steadfastness. It's not like this fixed thing, It's
Okay.
not about never changing your mind or never making a mistake. It's about constantly sort of checking in with yourself and making sure your choices are lining up with your values and commitments. And those can change over time, right? As we grow and learn new things.
I like that. Like, it takes the pressure off, You don't have to have everything figured out right now. It's more about being open to, like, adjusting your course as you go.
Hmm.
But how do you know when it's time to do that? Like, how do you tell the difference between those times when you need to, really dig in your heels and those times when it's better to step back and reevaluate?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And your source doesn't really give you a clear-cut formula, but they do talk about some guiding principles. And I think the biggest one is self-awareness, like really taking the time to think about your motivations and to notice those moments when you might be tempted to compromise your values or give up on something too soon.
So it's about asking yourself, like, why am I doing this? Is this still in line with who I am and what I believe in? Those sorts of things.
Exactly. But beyond just looking inward, your source also talks about how important it is to get outside perspectives, like talking to people you trust, friends, mentors, maybe even a therapist. Sometimes those conversations can help you, see things more clearly when you're struggling with a decision.
It's like having someone, like, hold up a mirror, right? They can help you spot those blind spots you might have missed on your own. The thing that's really stuck with me through all of this is that steadfastness, it's not about perfection. It's about resilience. Like, it's okay to mess up, to stumble, to fall down. It's about getting back up and trying again.
And that is such an important message, especially these days. We're constantly being told we have to be successful, we have to achieve all these things, we have to have it all. But your source is kind of whispering this different message, like, hey, the real strength, the real steadfastness, it's in the journey. It's in the messy process of figuring things out.
It's like those imperfections, those doubts, those moments of uncertainty, those are all part of it. They're actually opportunities to learn and grow. And remembering that, like, setbacks aren't failures, they're just, stepping stones.
And in a world where everything is constantly changing, that kind of resilience, that commitment to what matters most, your values, the people you love, that's more important than ever.
That is a beautiful way to put it. Steadfastness isn't about reaching some, like, final destination. It's about the journey, the ongoing process of becoming. It's about showing up, doing your best, even when it's hard, and knowing that it's okay to make mistakes along the way.
So well said. And to everyone listening, I would just say this. Remember that steadfastness, it's about continuously making the choice to live a life that reflects your deepest truths, even as you grow and change and the world around you changes.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into steadfastness. We hope it's given you some things to think about, maybe even sparked a little inspiration. And until next time, keep diving deep.